This is the 10th unit that I tend to do with my students through the school year, closer to the end of the year. We are going to solve quadratic equations, and the first thing we look at is how to solve quadratic equations by factoring. Now again, this is an equation, so there will be a solution. In the previous unit, that was factoring. I just gave expressions that we had to factor using methods like greatest common factor, difference of two perfect squares, grouping, and trinomial factoring, using either the Xbox area model or just a little bit of mental math to figure things out. The standard form for a quadratic equation is known as ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So this is the format that we want our equation to be in if we are going to use the factoring method to solve. So a, b, and c are just some random numbers that they happen to give in our problem. Being in the state I live in, Common Core states a is always going to be 1. So we're never going to have to worry about factoring a quadratic equation to solve it if my first number is not 1. So the rest of it, b and c, could be any number they so choose. We just have to make sure that we have the correct format in order to use the factoring method. So how are we going to solve quadratic equations? Well, first thing we have to make sure is it's in standard form. So we have to make sure our equation equals 0. Next, we have to factor it. Now, we may have to use anything like the greatest common factor or grouping in order to get to where we need to, but it is what we will have to do for our second step. Once we have factored, we're going to create what's known as a t-chart. Basically, this separates the two parentheses that I've created. Once I do that, I'm going to set each thing equal to 0 and solve for the variable. And then we always check our answer. So what they like to do is they like to use different wording, like find the unit. Like if I look at numbers 1 and 2 here, notice it says number 1, find the roots. Number 2, it says solve for y. It means the exact same thing. They just like to change the wording even though it means the same exact thing. So find the roots of r squared minus 12r plus 35 equals 0. So in order to factor this, we have to create two sets of parentheses. So if it's factorable, we will have two sets of parentheses, and it's going to equal 0. Now, just like before, we're only going to worry about factoring what's on the side with our letters and numbers. So remember, when it comes to factoring, the first guy in each parenthesis will have to multiply to r squared. Well, how do I get r squared through multiplication? Well, the only way in our case would be r times r. So r times r gives me r squared. Now I got to come up with the two numbers. The two numbers must do two things. First thing, they have to multiply to 35, and they have to add, in our case, to negative 12. So what we have to do is we have to come up with, we just list off some factors of 35. So if we look at 35, how do I get 35? Well, 35 times 1 and 5 times 7. And that's it. So which of these two pairs will give me 12? Well, 35 and 1, whenever I add or subtract them, will never ever get me close enough to 12. So 5 and 7 are the numbers that I'm going to be using. So 5 and 7. Now I have to come up with the signs that are going to go in there. Now, they multiply to a positive. So the only way I could get a positive through multiplication is a positive times positive or a negative times negative. So we take a look at what our middle number is. Middle number is negative, so this means both my signs have to be negative as well. Negative 5 times negative 7 gives me positive 35. Negative 5 minus 7 gives me negative 12. So here we have our factored form. We have found r minus 5 times r minus 7. Now what I have to do is I have to figure out what value of r will make my equation equal 0. So multiplication, the rule is anything times 0 is going to give me 0. So this means if my first parenthesis equals 0, my answer is going to get 0, regardless of whatever r minus 7 may equal. Same with r minus 7. If that ends up being 0, it doesn't matter what r minus 5 is, because that times 0 is going to give me 0. So this is why we make this t-chart. What we do is we separate the two, and we're going to set each one equal to 0. So we have r minus 5 equals 0, and r minus 7 equals 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the value of r that makes my equation equal 0. So what I'll do here, to get r by itself, I add 5 to both sides, which means r equals 5. And on the other side, we'll add 7 to both sides. So this means r equals 7. So if I were to plug these numbers in for r, so it would be 5 squared minus 12 times 5 plus 35. So if I were to check that out, so 5 squared minus 12 times 5 plus 35, I get 0. So 5 is good. And next, I'll check 7. 7 squared minus 12 times 7 plus 35 gives me 0 as well. So 7 and 5 are my answers. Number 2, I'm going to do the same exact thing. Y squared plus 11y plus 24 equals 0. So it's in standard form. It equals 0, so we're good there. What I do now is to factor it. I know I will create 2 sets of parentheses, and it is equal to 0. So now I got to come up with what goes inside the parentheses. So how do I get y squared? Well, the only way I can get y squared is y times y. Next, I have to come up with the numbers. The numbers in here are going to do, again, 2 things. They have to multiply to 24 and add to positive 11. So what we'll do is we'll just list off things that can multiply to 24. So 24 times 1, 12 times 2, 8 times 3, 6 times 4. So out of these 4 possible pairings, we have to pick the one that will add to 11. So 24 plus 1, 25, 24 minus 1 give me 23. So not 11. 12 plus 2 is 14. 12 minus 2 is 10. So it can't be that. 8 plus 3 gives me 11. 8 minus 3 is 5. So 8 and 3 are possible. And then if I look at 6 and 4, 6 plus 4 gives me 10. 6 minus 4 is 2. So we are going to be dealing with 8 and 3. So again, multiply to a positive 24. So that means either positive times positive or negative times negative. So if I take a look at that middle term, the middle term is positive. So positive 8 and a positive 3 will make positive 11. So once we have it factored like this, again, I need to know what value of y will give me an answer of 0. So through multiplication, each set of parentheses will have to equal 0. So we make a t-chart, we separate them, and we're going to make each parenthesis equal 0. So y plus 8 equals 0, and y plus 3 equals 0. And all I'm going to do is solve for y. So here we have to subtract 8. So we end up with y equals negative 8. And then on this side, we subtract 3 from both sides, and we get y equals negative 3. And again, if you want to check your answer, we just plug negative 8 and negative 3 in. So again, when we use the TI-83 plus calculator, whatever number we use, if it's negative, we have to put it in parentheses, especially if we're squaring it. So negative 8 squared plus 11 times negative 8 plus 24 gives me 0. And I'll do the same thing for negative 3. So again, we got to put negative 3 in parentheses. We square it, and we add 11 times negative 3 plus 24. And we get 0. So it turns out our numbers are good. So our values, y negative 8 and y value of negative 3, make my equation true. Number 3, we're going to do the same thing. It's in standard form, so we can use the up above method in order to solve it. Now I'm going to go ahead to number 4, solve for y squared minus 3y equals 28. Now this one's a little bit different. It's not in the correct format. My equation has to equal 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to make it equal 0. So how do we make it equal 0? Well, we got to bring the 28 over. So we're going to subtract 28 from both sides. So 28 minus 28 goes away. They cancel out. It leaves me with equals 0 because 28 minus 28 is 0. Now I cannot take 28 away from y squared or minus 3y. So we're just left with y squared minus 3y minus 28. Now what I'll do is I'll do the same up above factoring method in order to figure out values of y. So we know we make 2 sets of parentheses and that it equals 0. First thing, we'll multiply to y squared. So the only thing that can multiply to y squared is y times y. Next thing, we got to come up with the numbers. And again, the numbers must multiply to negative 28 and add to negative 3. So what numbers will multiply to 28? Well, we got 28 times 1, 14 times 2, 7 times 4. So we have 3 options here. Somehow we need to get to 3. So here we got 28 and 1. 28 plus 1 gives me 29. 28 minus 1 gives me 27. So there's no way I could get to 3. Or in this case, negative 3. If I look at 14, 14 plus 2 gives me 16. 14 minus 2 gives me 14. So there's no way, or gives me 12. So there's no way I will get 3. Now 7 and 4, 7 plus 4 gives me 11. 7 minus 4 will give me the 3. So there is the numbers that we're going to use. We're going to use 7 and 4. Now the question becomes, how do I get the negative 28 through multiplication? Well, multiplication, the only way I can get a negative is a positive times a negative. So this means one of them is plus and the other one is going to be minus. The question is, which one? Well, we always look at the middle term. The middle term is minus. So in that case, we know from previous experience that the larger of the two numbers in our line here will get the sign that is in the middle term. So if the middle term is minus, that means the larger of the two numbers here will be minus. So 7 and 4, 7 is the bigger of the two, so that's where my minus sign will go. And then 4 will get plus. So negative 7 times 4 gives me negative 28. Negative 7 plus 4 gives me minus 3. So we're good there. Next thing up, we need to figure out the values of y that give me an answer of 0. So t-chart is created. I'm going to separate the two and set each one equal to 0. So y minus 7 equals 0 and y plus 4 equals 0. Add 7 to both sides here, and we end up getting y equals 7. On the other side, we'll subtract 4 from both sides, and we get y equals negative 4. So there are the two values of y that will give me an answer of 0. Now number 5 says find the roots. X squared plus equals x plus 30. So here again, we need to figure out the value of x that makes our equation equal to 0. The only problem here is my equation does not equal 0. So what we need to do is make it equal to 0. Now the thing is, we like x squared to be positive. So if x squared is positive, that means I move the other stuff. If x squared was not positive, if it was negative, I would move it in order to make it positive. So here we have a positive x squared, so I'm going to leave it there. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to move the other guys. So x, I'm going to move it by subtracting an x, and a positive 30, I can subtract 30 in order to move it to the other side. So again, what I do to one side, I do to the other. So x minus x and 30 minus 30, I now have an equation that equals 0. Now I cannot take x or 30 away from x squared, nor can I take 30 away from x. So what I'm left with is x squared minus x minus 30. So what I'm going to do here, again, is we are factoring. So factoring means this gets split up into two sets of parentheses, and we equal 0. Now the first item in each one will multiply to the first item in our problem. So first item is x squared. How do I get x squared through multiplication? Well, the only way is x times x. So x times x gives me x squared. Now with the 30 and the minus x, again, there's no number that I see here. However, because I have an x there, I can say there is a 1. So it's x squared minus 1x minus 30. What we have to do is we have to come up with two numbers that multiply to negative 30 and add to negative 1. So just like before, it's much easier to list off items that multiply to the 30, which ends up being 30 and 1, 15 times 2, 10 times 3, 6 times 5. So out of these four, we have to pick the one that will add to negative 1. So 30 and 1, no way. 31 versus 29 if I subtract. 15 plus 2 gives me 17. 15 minus 2 is 13. 10 plus 3 is 13. 10 minus 3 is 7. 6 plus 5 gives me 11, whereas 6 minus 5 gives me 1. So because my difference is 1, that's the one I want to use, 6 and 5. Next step up is to put the signage that goes in there. So again, we are multiplying to a negative. And the only way I get a negative when I multiply is a positive times a negative. So this means 6 or 5 will be positive, and then the other one has to be negative. So question is, which one gets it? The bigger of the two numbers gets the sign that's on the middle term. So the middle term is negative, which means the bigger of the two numbers we came up with will be minus. So 6 and 5, 6 is bigger, so minus goes with 6, and plus goes to 5. From here, we're going to separate it with a t-chart and set each one equal to 0. So x minus 6 equals 0. X plus 5 equals 0. What we do is add 6 here. So it cancels out. X equals 0 plus 6 gives me 6. And then on this side, we'll subtract 5. 5s will cancel out there, leaving me with x equals negative 5. So again, here are the two values of x that will make this statement true. That will make my equation equal to 0. Number 6, we are asked to find the zeros. 5w squared equals 35. This one, we could separate it. However, if we look at it as a straightforward equation, 5w squared equals 35. This one, we don't have to work as hard. We can actually just solve for w. W is on one side, numbers on the other, so we're good there. So first thing first, we want to divide by 5 here. Because 5 divided by 5 leaves me with w squared. And then 35 divided by 5 gives me 7. Now again, we want to know what w is, not w squared. So to get rid of the exponent of 2, we take the square root of both sides. What this does is the square root and the square cancel out, leaving me with w equals. Now, 7 is not a nice number to take the square root. So if I take the square root of 7, I get 2.64575131, yada, yada, yada. It's not nice. So we're going to leave it as the square root of 7. However, whenever I take the square root of a number, I actually get two different values. I get a positive value and a negative value. So whenever we take the square root of a number, we put a little plus and minus to indicate that we have a positive root 7 and a negative root 7. If you're unsure, well, if we do 5 times the square root of 7 squared, I get 35. So positive root 7 is good. Now, if I do the negative root, so 5 times the negative square root of 7, and I square it, I also get positive 35. So that's why we can use positive and negative whenever I take the square root of a number. So that one was a little easier. I didn't have to use factoring method in order to come up with the answer. And that is using factoring in order to find the roots, the zeros, or solving an equation.